In today's video, we are going to be looking at a video by PragerU called The Inconvenient Truth of the Democratic Party. And the reason why we're doing this is because there's a lot of misinformation in this video, and I want to make sure to go through all of it, or at least most of it, so you can get an idea and make up your own mind as to whether this video is true or it isn't. Now, PragerU prides themselves in being a conservative organization or a conservative think tank or whatever the hell they are. I don't know, but it's conservative nonetheless. Now, in this video, conspicuously, the word conservative is never mentioned once in this video, even though many of their other videos, they mention it all the time. And we'll get into why that is in a second. Hello, welcome to Soapbox Politics. My name is Dave, and if you're interested in getting more content, please go ahead and subscribe, hit the little bell so that you are updated on any of the new videos that I have. It'd be great to have you on board as a subscriber. Now, before we get into it, I want to talk about something that's very important for understanding this video, and I talked about it a little bit in the intro, which is the difference between ideology and partisanship. Now, ideology is left, right, center, moderate, liberal, conservative. It's where you are on the political spectrum. So ideology has been around ever since the beginning of politics. We can look at ancient Greece and the politicians there and determine if they're left, right, center based on the politics of that time. And this continuum has gone on throughout the ages. So we can look at any political system and determine if it's left, right, or center based on its time, and also based maybe on the country, because what is considered left, right, and center in Saudi Arabia will be very different than in Sweden, for example. But that's what ideology is the moderate, conservative, liberal aspect of politics. Now, partisanship is totally different. Partisanship is your political party identification. Democrat, Republican, Independent, for example, here in the United States. If you go to Britain, it's Tory, Labor, maybe Liberal Dem. Each country has their own partisan leanings, and partisanship has to do with political parties. And unlike ideology that has, we can look at it through the past and determine what is conservative and liberal, what political parties come and go. Some last a long time, like the Democratic Party in the United States, while others, such as En Marche or Ensemble, or whatever it's called now in France, the party of Emmanuel Macron, has only been around for a little over 7 years. So political parties come and go, and the ideologies within those political parties change constantly. So we can't say that what a political party was, let's say 100 years ago, or specifically in this situation, 160 years ago, is the same political party that we have now as far as ideologies. Ideologies change. And this is an important part of this video because what PragerU tries to do is conflate the two. They want you to think of the modern day Democratic Party and not talk about the conservative aspect of that party back during the Civil War and up till the 1960s and really the 1970s. This is the reason why in this video they never utter the word conservative or liberal, because if PragerU actually used the word conservative for all the things that were done that were the conservatives, they would be looking like the bad guys. And if they mentioned the liberal things like Lincoln freeing the slaves, which was not a conservative idea, it was a liberal idea, then that would also make them look like the bad guys. So they have to keep it within the context of partisanship and not ideology, even though almost all their other videos are usually about ideology. So that is an important aspect to understand about this video.
When you think about racial equality and civil rights, which political party comes to mind?
Now, it should be noted that Dr. Swain retired right after this video was made, and a lot of the students at Vanderbilt University did not want her to be a teacher, and a lot of people said she was just a horrible professor. So what she says you have to take with a big grain of salt just due to that fact. She announced her retirement beforehand. The reason why she announced her retirement was because there was a lot of pressure to actually get rid of her. So she had a little bit of time in between to be able to still say, I'm a Vanderbilt University professor, but a few months later, she wasn't. So she was able to squeeze that in, but there's a lot of controversy around her. You can just find that on the internet. All right, let's continue.
When you think about racial equality and civil rights, which political party comes to mind? The Republicans or the Democrats? Most people would probably say the Democrats, but this answer is incorrect.
All right, so I do think of the Democrats because if we're talking about the civil rights movement, we're talking about the 1957 Civil Rights Act, introduced into Congress by Democrats, supported by Democrats in both the House and Senate, signed into law by probably the most liberal Republican of the 20th century, Dwight Eisenhower, but it was mostly Democrats pushing it, especially Lyndon Johnson. The 1964 Civil Rights Act, Democratic Congress, Democratic Senate, Democratic President signed it into law. Same thing with the 1965 Voting Rights Act and the 1968 Civil Rights Act. So yes, I would say that they are synonymous, that the Democrats are synonymous with the Civil Rights Act because they were in control of Congress the whole entire time, which means that they could have not ever put it on the floor. The speaker could say, we're not even going to hear this, but they did put it on the floor. They did allow it to have a vote, and it did eventually go on to the president. 3 of the 4 were Democratic administrations. So, yes, I would say the Democratic Party is pretty much the party with civil rights.
Dred Scott versus Sandford. The court ruled that slaves aren't citizens, they're property. The 7 justices who voted in favor of slavery, all Democrats. The 2 justices who dissented, both Republicans.
Justice Curtis actually eventually said that the Emancipation Proclamation was unconstitutional and that Abraham Lincoln was extremely incompetent. So take that for what you want, but it's interesting to know that one of the 2 Republicans that we have just said that the Emancipation Proclamation was unconstitutional. All right, let's continue.
6 days after the Confederate Army surrendered, John Wilkes Booth, a Democrat, assassinated President Lincoln.
So this is where the first lie comes in, which is there is no proof whatsoever that John Wilkes Booth was a Democrat. Now, a lot of conservatives want to claim this, but there's just absolutely no proof whatsoever. As a matter, factcheck.org went ahead and looked into this because there have been a lot of claims of people saying this, and they found that there's absolutely no proof whatsoever that John Wilkes Booth was a Democrat. However, there is a history of him and actual evidence of him before the Civil War doing some kind of little work or supporting candidates of the Know Nothing Party, which was a very anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic, anti-Irish, anti-Italian, anti-Eastern European political party that eventually merged with the Republican Party, not the Democratic Party. So yes, John Wilkes Booth hated Catholics, hated Irish, hated Italians, and that eventually went to the Republican Party, not the Democratic Party. So let's go ahead and continue with the video.
Much of it instigated by the Ku Klux Klan, founded by a Democrat, Nathan Bedford Forrest. As historian Eric Foner, himself a Democrat, notes, in effect, the Klan was a military force serving the interests of the Democratic Party.
All right, so here we go into another misconception. Now, was Nathan Bedford Forrest a Democrat? Yes, he was. He was a member of the city council in Memphis as a Democrat. So that is true. But the fact that the Democrats were the ones that were really behind the creation of the KKK and that the Democrats supported the KKK is simply not the case, because the Democratic Party, while yes, in the South, was also in the North, and a lot of Democrats in the North had no affiliation with the KKK whatsoever and had no involvement with the KKK whatsoever. So to say that this was something that the Democrats supported would be totally wrong. And as a matter of fact, PolitiFact went ahead and checked this and found this to be a lie because it was something that started spreading in the Republican world in recent years, that the KKK was the military arm of the Democratic Party. Now, was this quote said by this professor? Yes. Now, she says he's a Democratic professor, but I don't see any evidence that he is actually a Democrat. However, he is left-leaning, and you can tell that by some of the interviews that he has done. Again, ideology and partisanship doesn't mean the same thing. Bernie Sanders is to the left, but he's an independent. Nelson Rockefeller was to the left, but he was a Republican. Joe Manchin is more to the center right, and he's a Democrat. So whatever ideology you have, it doesn't mean you automatically connect with the partisanship that's associated with that ideology. So there's no evidence that he's a Democrat. And on top of that, there's more to that quote, which also includes the idea that this wasn't a political movement as much as it was to keep white supremacy in the South. I'm going to go ahead and link the article down below so you can go ahead and take a look at the entire quote that they have. Now, it seems like they're saying that because Nathan Bedford Forrest was a Democrat, therefore Democrats endorse the idea of the KKK. Well, we can't just do this guilt by association. If we want to play this game, if Dr. Swain wants to play this game, okay, we'll do it. Now, in a more recent example, in 1968, Ted Bundy was a member of the Republican Party, actually supported Republican Governor Evans of Washington State, and was active in Republican politics. So by that deduction, that means that Ted Bundy, who was a Republican and in the Washington Republican Party establishment, that means that the Republicans then supported the things that Ted Bundy did, like murder innocent college students, right? I mean, I'm not making the rules. Dr. Swain's making the rules. So if we're going to look at this guilt by association thing, we need to say that the Republicans supported Ted Bundy and supported his ideas, just like the Democrats supported Nathan Bedford Forrest and his ideas. Now, on a more serious note, how fucking stupid does that sound? Okay, I just want to throw that out there. Let's go ahead and watch some more of the video.
The only serious congressional opposition to the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964 came from Democrats.
Yeah, except for the fact that one of those senators who opposed it was actually eventual 1964 Republican nominee, Barry Goldwater. So she doesn't want to talk about that at all. And it's the reason why the electoral map in 64 looked like this instead of how it looked in 1956, like this. So she conveniently just wants to keep Barry Goldwater, a conservative and a Republican who was the presidential nominee for the Republican Party. She just wants to forget that. So let's continue with the video.
Democratic senators filibustered the bill for 75 days until Republicans mustered the few extra votes needed to break the logjam.
This is true, which, by the way, Strom Thurmond, a Republican senator, was also in on the filibuster. Now, Strom Thurmond is very famous for his 1957 filibuster, where he was a Democrat. However, he switched to the Republican Party. I wonder why. So, yeah, Republicans filibustered this as well. All right, let's continue.
If black people are going to vote, they might as well vote for Democrats, as President Lyndon Johnson was purported to have said about the Civil Rights Act. I'll have them voting Democrat for 200 years.
So there's absolutely no evidence whatsoever that LBJ actually said this. The first time that this quote actually appears in print was in a 1995 book by Ronald Kessler about the presidency. And this quote is from one Air Force One steward and hasn't been collaborated by anybody else. So this quote came about Lyndon Johnson 22 years after he was dead. And the source of it is just one person, and there's been no confirmation from anybody else in regards to the source of this. So Ronald Kessler, the person who did write this book, has had a lot of controversy as somebody who likes to cram a lot of shit in his book that just has no hard evidence or facts, and it's just kind of his beliefs. So her using him just kind of proves the point that she herself can't use actual facts that can be corroborated by a number of people to back up what she thinks. Okay? It's par for the course. So the other thing they seem to imply is that it was the 64 Voting Rights Act that made it, they realized that they needed to get black voters and more of them on their side. But black voters had been voting overwhelmingly for Democrats since 1936. In fact, factcheck.org looked at this and found that black voters all the way back in 1936 were voting 71% for FDR. And that trend continued through to today, with the lowest number being about 60% of black support for Adlai Stevenson in the rematch that he had with Dwight Eisenhower in 1956. So black voters have always been strongly Democrat, or at least in my lifetime and in most of our lifetimes. It wasn't the 1964 election that all of a sudden made Democrats realize, we have to get black votes. It had been happening since 1936. And on top of that, as far as partisan identification, people saying that they are a Democrat or a Republican, black voters started strongly identifying with the Democratic Party as far as their own identity starting in 1948. And again, that trend didn't move. All of this is done and looked at by factcheck.org. Again, the link is down below and you can look at that as well. So one last thing on this point is that Johnson, if he really didn't want black people to vote, and Democrats, they really didn't want black people to vote, they could have just not introduced the law and Johnson could have vetoed it. And if Democrats were so against the Civil Rights Act, if Johnson vetoed it, well, they wouldn't have, the Republicans, who were never in the majority at this time, would never have had the votes to override the veto. So this whole idea that, the Democrats were forced to do the Voting Rights Act and all that is total hogwash. I mean, Lyndon Johnson had supported voting rights and civil rights when he was in the Senate and then through his vice presidency and his presidency. So the fact that he actually moved further ahead on civil rights than John F. Kennedy before him.
Massive government welfare has decimated the black family.
All right, so there's more white people on welfare, so I don't know what she's getting on with this. Okay, let's keep going.
Politically correct policing has left black neighborhoods defenseless against violent crime.
Yeah, I think George Floyd would disagree. I think anyone who's been racially profiled by the police and either have been detained improperly or for no reason at all, or have been assaulted by an officer, or in the case of George Floyd, killed by an officer, I think they might have a different view of this situation. All right, so I just wanted to go through this video and talk about how ridiculous it is and how much of the information they have in there is actually either not provable or just wrong. And as you can see, if you go through this video and talk about all the things that the conservatives did, and then all the things that the liberals did, you will all of a sudden see that the narrative of the story doesn't necessarily go PragerU's way. This is the reason why they cannot use the word conservative or liberal once through this entire video. Because again, as I mentioned earlier, political parties are just empty vessels that change from election to election in many cases. What people believe now in the Democratic or Republican Party might be different. So Trump's Republican Party is very, very different than Eisenhower's Republican Party. So to say that they are the same, they're not really the same. Political parties are different. They need to use the political party aspect of this in order to make their argument somewhat valid. They can't use conservative because conservatives are the ones that actually enslaved people, took away voting rights, and did all the other stuff that PragerU says is bad. And you know what? They're right. It is bad. Just PragerU, tell us, were they conservatives or liberal? Would love to know. Just go ahead. Give a shout out on that one. Now, if you want to know about where the Republican Party is, seriously, just watch Lee Atwater. See what he says about black voters and white voters in the South during Wallace, during Nixon, during Reagan, and then eventually during Bush. Look at what he says. As a matter of fact, I'll play a clip of Republican Lee Atwater and what his thoughts are on his strategy for winning over voters. And by the way, he never was a Democrat. He was a Republican. All right, let's go ahead and look at this.
Here's how I would approach that issue as a statistician or a political scientist, or no, as a psychologist, which I'm not, is how abstract you handle the race thing. In other words, you start out, and now y'all aren't quoting me on this. All right, I won't hear it. You start out in 1954 by saying nigger, nigger, nigger. By 1968, you can't say nigger. That hurts you, backfires. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. And you're getting so abstract now, you're talking about cutting taxes, and all of these things you're talking about are totally economic things, and the byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites. And subconsciously, maybe that is part of it. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that if it is getting that abstract and that coded, that we're doing away with the racial problem one way or the other. You follow me? Because obviously sitting around saying, we want to cut taxes, we want to cut this, and we want, is much more abstract than even the busing thing. And a hell of a lot more abstract than Nigger Nigger, you know. So any way you look at it, race is coming on the back burner.